He was a Grand Admiral of an Imperial Navy, a prince of a 600-year-old dynasty, and a man so rich, so fluent, and so perfectly positioned that a kingdom was literally created for him. Yet he was politically undermined by his own emperor, outmaneuvered by his allies, and left to die a forgotten citizen of a republic. He would see one son perish in a Soviet prison and another son tortured by the very nation he had adopted as his own, a nation he had once dreamed of ruling. His name was Archduke Karl Stephan of Austria. How could a man who represented the absolute peak of European aristocracy, a man who did everything right, fall so far, so fast, and so completely? The man who had tried to become King of Poland was, first and foremost, a product of the world that created him. Karl Stephan was born an Archduke of Austria. This was not simply a title, it was a job description, a genetic destiny, and a non-negotiable contract with the empire. From the moment he drew breath, his life was not his own. It belonged to the House of Habsburg. His education, like that of all archdukes, was a relentless machine designed to produce one of two things: a potential emperor or a high-ranking loyal servant of the emperor. The curriculum was brutal. He would have been steeped in languages. German and Hungarian were mandatory, as were French and Czech. He studied military strategy, dynastic law, theology, and the intricate labyrinthine history of his own family. There was no room for personal passion unless it served the state. There was no room for error, as any mistake would reflect on the dynasty itself. And shadowing this entire education was the colossal legacy of his grandfather, Archduke Charles, Duke of Teschen. This wasn't just any ancestor. This was the man who in 1809 at the Battle of Aspern-Essling had done the impossible. He had handed Napoleon Bonaparte his first major defeat in a decade. Imagine the pressure of that. In a family that measured success in terms of military glory and imperial preservation, Karl Stephan's grandfather was a titan, a near mythical figure. Every time he looked at a portrait in the palace, every time he studied military history, he was being reminded of this simple, terrifying fact. This is what a Habsburg Archduke is capable of. This is the standard. This legacy placed an immense burden of expectation on the young Archduke. He was expected to be a leader, a warrior, and a politician, all in one. But Karl Stephan was also smart. He understood that the battlefields of the late 19th century might not be fought with cannon and cavalry alone. The new battles were ones of industry, of culture, and of public opinion. And it was in this new arena that he would make his first and most significant strategic move. The pivotal moment arrived in 1895. His uncle, Archduke Albrecht, Duke of Teschen, died. Albrecht had been a towering figure, a field marshal, a hero of the Austro-Prussian War, and, crucially, the wealthiest man in the entire Habsburg Empire. He was a staunch conservative of the old school. When he died, his vast fortune and estates were divided, and Karl Stephan inherited a truly staggering prize, the Teschen inheritance in Galicia, the Austrian-controlled portion of Poland. This inheritance was centered around the town of Żywiec. This wasn't the glittering, multi-ethnic high society of Vienna. This was Poland. It was a land with a deep, proud, and profoundly wounded national identity, a nation that had been literally erased from the map a century earlier, carved up by Austria, Russia, and Prussia. The Poles in Galicia lived under the relatively benign rule of the Habsburgs, but they never for one moment stopped dreaming of a restored and independent Poland. And into this complex, politically charged world steps Archduke Karl Stephan. He doesn't just treat Żywiec as a summer home or a source of income. He makes a conscious, deliberate choice. He moves there. He and his wife, Archduchess Maria Theresia, make Żywiec Castle their permanent family seat. This was a radical act. He was, in effect, leaving the center of imperial power to live on its periphery. But it was a calculated move. He immediately began a profound process of cultural immersion. He learned to speak Polish, and not just the polite phrases of a landowner to his tenants. He learned it fluently, with perfect pronunciation. He insisted his children learn it too, to the point where they spoke it at home, often in preference to German. He began patronizing Polish arts, sciences, and cultural institutions. He was, in short, presenting himself not as an Austrian overlord, but as a Polish patriot who just happened to be a Habsburg. And at the heart of his new domain was the jewel in his crown, the Żywiec Brewery. This wasn't just some quaint aristocratic hobby. When Karl Stephan inherited it, it was already one of the largest and most modern breweries in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He poured his energy and wealth into it, expanding it, modernizing its technology, and turning it into a global brand. Żywiec beer began winning international awards, celebrated for its quality. This made Karl Stephan a different kind of aristocrat. He wasn't just a landowner living off ancient rents. He was a captain of industry, a major employer, and a critical part of the regional economy. The local population, both the Polish gentry and the common workers, came to respect him. He wasn't a distant figure in Vienna. He was their Archduke. He was building a power base, brick by brick, barrel by barrel. He was making himself indispensable. He was, consciously or not, building a case for himself as the natural and logical choice to lead a restored Poland should the opportunity ever arise. Decades later, after the storms of 2 world wars had passed, the communist regime that took control of Poland would nationalize the Żywiec Brewery. This wasn't a business transaction. It was a symbolic execution. It was the new totalitarian order declaring the old world, the world of archdukes and private property, and Habsburg influence to be over. The brewery, which had survived the collapse of an empire, was seized without compensation. Karl Stephan's son, Karl Albrecht, who had fought in the Polish army against the Nazis, would be imprisoned by the communists, tortured and stripped of everything. The very asset that Karl Stephan used to build his Polish identity, the symbol of his integration and success, would, in the end, become a symbol of his family's ultimate ruin. It was a complete and total erasure of their legacy in Eastern Europe, a theft legitimized by ideology. The wealth he had hoped to use to secure a crown for his family would instead vanish, leaving his descendants impoverished and dispossessed, a bitter, tragic postscript to his grand ambitions. But in the 1880s and 1890s, this dark future was unimaginable. Karl Stephan's star was on the rise, and he solidified it with a perfect dynastic match. In 1886, he married Archduchess Maria Theresia, a Habsburg from the Italian branch of the family. She was a princess of Tuscany, a descendant of another long line of rulers. It was, by all accounts, a stable and supportive union. Maria Theresia embraced her husband's Polish project completely. She moved to Żywiec, learned Polish herself, and oversaw the education of their 6 children, raising them as Poles. They were a model family projecting an image of domestic harmony, Catholic piety, and deep cultural loyalty, all essential qualities for a potential royal couple. Their children became the living embodiments of this dual identity. They were Habsburg archdukes and archduchesses, but they were also, for all intents and purposes, Polish. The 2 eldest sons, in particular, came to represent the family's complex geopolitical ambitions. Karl Albrecht, the heir, was his father's shadow. He was groomed to inherit the Polish estates and, perhaps, the Polish crown. He would, like his father, become fluent in Polish and would one day serve as a general in the Polish army. But it was the youngest son, Wilhelm, who revealed the true scope of the family's vision. Wilhelm was a romantic, charismatic, and somewhat rebellious spirit. While his father and older brother focused on Poland, Wilhelm became fascinated with another, even more complex culture, Ukraine. He learned the Ukrainian language, wrote poetry, and began to dream of a future for the Ukrainian people who were then split between the Austrian and Russian empires. He would become known as Vasil Vyshevany, Basil the Embroidered, for his habit of wearing the traditional Ukrainian embroidered shirt. This wasn't just a teenage phase, it was a strategic decision, likely encouraged by his father. While Karl Stephan aimed for the throne in Warsaw, he was positioning his son as a potential leader for a new, independent Ukraine. The family wasn't just aiming for one kingdom, they were aiming for two. It was a breathtakingly ambitious plan, a Habsburg attempt to manage and, in their view, lead the rising nationalist forces of Eastern Europe. The final and most brilliant move in Karl Stephan's grand strategy was the marriage of his daughters. If you want to bind yourself to a nation, you marry its aristocracy. And Karl Stephan didn't just aim for any aristocrats, he aimed for the very top. In 1912, his daughter Mechtildis married Prince Olgierd Czartoryski. The following year, his daughter Renata married Prince Hieronym Radziwiłł. To a casual observer, these might seem like just another pair of obscure aristocratic weddings. To anyone who understood Polish history, this was a political earthquake. The Czartoryski and Radziwiłł families were not just nobles, they were magnates. They were the uncrowned kings of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For centuries, they had fielded their own private armies, controlled the election of kings, and held more wealth and power than many reigning monarchs in Europe. They had survived the partitions of Poland by playing the great powers of Russia, Austria, and Prussia against each other. They were the living, breathing embodiment of Polish political history. By marrying his daughters into these two powerful, almost royal houses, Karl Stephan was doing something revolutionary. He was merging his Habsburg blood, his imperial connections, and his industrial wealth with the ancient, almost sacred political legitimacy of Poland's most powerful families. It was the masterstroke. He had now, through his lands, his language, his brewery, and his children's marriages, become not just a candidate for a future Polish throne, but the only logical candidate. He had tied himself to Poland so completely that it seemed impossible to separate him from it. And here we must confront the second cruel fact. This masterstroke, this move that he believed would guarantee his success, would prove to be the very thing that sealed his failure. It was a betrayal so profound, so cynical, it undermined his entire life's work. Karl Stephan believed these marriages were tools for his royal ambition. He believed he was gaining allies. What he failed to understand was that to the Radziwiłłs and Czartoryskis, he was the tool. These families had survived for 500 years by being more cunning, more ruthless, and more pragmatic than the empires that tried to control them. They had seen kings rise and empires fall. They saw Karl Stephan not as the future king of Poland, but as an Austrian puppet, a pawn in a game being played by Vienna and Berlin. They had their own deeply entrenched interests, many of which were tied not to Austria, but to the vast estates they still held inside the Russian Empire. So, when the great game began, when the question of a new Poland was finally, truly on the table during the World War I, Karl Stephan's new in-laws did the unthinkable. Instead of lobbying for their Habsburg relative, they quietly and effectively began lobbying for Russian-backed alternatives. They played the old game. They saw a better deal, or a more familiar path by working with St. Petersburg. They may have also resented this Habsburg newcomer, this German-speaking Archduke who had so audaciously tried to buy his way into their world and claim its ultimate prize. The political reality was twofold. It was personal. The families he had joined his own to were pursuing their own complex, pre-existing interests, which did not align with his candidacy. And it was political. His German and Austrian allies, who were already suspicious of his deep polonization, saw this. They saw that he couldn't even control his own in-laws. It made him look weak, naive, and politically toxic. The very alliances he had built to prove his Polish credentials instead proved to his backers that he was a bad investment. The grand foundation of ambition and integration, so meticulously constructed over decades, had been built on political quicksand. He had done everything right to become Polish, only to discover that he had fatally misjudged the true brutal nature of Polish politics. He was surrounded by allies, but in the end, he was utterly, devastatingly alone. But the story of Karl Stephan is one of a man who lived two lives. While one foot was firmly and strategically planted in the rich soil of Poland, the other stood on the steel deck of an imperial warship. His Polish project was a grand dynastic ambition, but his day job, his lifelong profession, was that of a hard-nosed, dedicated, and deeply serious military man. He was not just a dilettante archduke playing landowner, he was one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. And his chosen service was, in itself, a curious and ambitious choice, the Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine, the Imperial and Royal Navy. This was the great paradox. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a land empire. It was a vast, sprawling mass of territory stretching from the Alps to the Carpathians, ruled from Vienna, a city hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The army, with its centuries of tradition, was the senior service, the bedrock of Habsburg power. The Navy was the junior partner, a coastal defense force based in the Adriatic ports of Pola, Trieste, and Cattaro. But at the turn of the 20th century, this was changing. The great powers were in the grip of a global fever, navalism. A nation, it was believed, could not be truly great without a powerful modern blue-water navy. Britain had set the standard, Germany was racing to catch up, and every other nation, from America to Japan to Italy, was pouring its resources into building the new symbols of industrial might, dreadnoughts. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was desperate to join this club. Its primary rival was not just Russia on land, but its own supposed ally, Italy, in the Mediterranean. The Adriatic was their only outlet to the sea, and they intended to dominate it. This is the world that Karl Stephan entered, not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as a career officer. He was commissioned in 1879, a young man of 19, and began the long, hard climb. This was not a life of gilded luxury. The Habsburg dynasty was famously, and often coldly, pragmatic about its archdukes. They were expected to serve, and to serve with distinction. His early years were spent on long, arduous voyages, taking him far from the comforts of Vienna. He sailed to Brazil and North America, learning the craft of seamanship, navigation, and command. These weren't pleasure cruises. They were geopolitical reconnaissance. He was the empire's eyes and ears, a royal diplomat in a naval uniform, observing the industrial and military power of rising nations like the United States. He was a natural. He was intelligent, disciplined, and had a genuine aptitude for the technical side of naval warfare. He rose steadily, captain, rear admiral, vice admiral. By 1911, he had achieved the rank of admiral. And by the time the Great War erupted, he was elevated to a rank that few in the empire's history had ever held: Grand Admiral. This rank was the absolute pinnacle of naval command, the direct equivalent of a field marshal in the army. To put this in perspective, his own brother, Archduke Friedrich, would serve as the army's commander-in-chief. For a time, two brothers, two Habsburg archdukes, effectively controlled the entire military and naval apparatus of a 50 million person empire at war. Karl Stephan was not just a player, he was one of the most powerful military figures in all of Central Europe. His formal role was Marine Inspecteur, or Navy Inspector. This title sounds dry, but its power was immense. He wasn't the man commanding a fleet in a single battle. He was the man responsible for building the entire Navy. He oversaw training, weapon development, strategic doctrine, and, most critically, the massive shipbuilding program. He was the administrative and technical brain of the Navy, the driving force behind its modernization. He was the man bringing the dreadnoughts to life, ensuring the empire could compete in the 20th century. It was a high-pressure, technologically demanding, and politically treacherous job. He had to fight the army generals in Vienna for every crown, arguing that steel-plated battleships were just as important as infantry divisions. He had to manage the complex multi-ethnic crews of the fleet, where Germans, Hungarians, Croats, and Italians all had to work together in the cramped, dangerous confines of a warship. He was, by all accounts, very good at it. He was a modernizer, a technocrat, a man who understood the complex machinery of a modern military. And then, in February 1918, his world cracked open. At the key naval base of Cattaro, the sailors of the fleet, starved, exhausted, and infected with the revolutionary ideas sweeping across Europe from Bolshevik Russia, rose up in a massive mutiny. They imprisoned their officers, raised the red flag, and issued a list of demands ranging from better food to an immediate democratic peace. The mutiny was brutally suppressed, but for the empire, it was a terrifying shock. It was a sign that the very pillars of the state were rotting from within. The emperor, a young and desperate Charles I, needed someone he could trust absolutely to investigate the disaster, and more importantly, to fix it. He turned to Grand Admiral Karl Stephan. Karl Stephan was given the grim task of leading the inquiry into the mutiny. His findings were blunt, honest, and damning. He didn't just blame a few revolutionary agitators. He pointed to a complete breakdown in leadership, to the arrogance and incompetence of the officer corps, and to the impossible conditions the sailors had been forced to endure. It was a courageous report, one that risked alienating powerful figures, but it was the truth. And in the wake of this report, he made a fateful recommendation. The Navy, he argued, needed a new commander-in-chief, a man who was not part of the old aristocratic clique, a man who was tough, disciplined, and utterly ruthless, someone the sailors both feared and respected. He knew just the man. His name was Miklos Horthy. By recommending Horthy to the emperor, Karl Stephan effectively set in motion the career of the man who would go on to rule Hungary as its regent for over 2 decades. It's a stunning historical what-if. Karl Stephan, the man who so desperately wanted to be a king himself, became a kingmaker, elevating the man who would become one of Europe's most durable authoritarian leaders. This was the apex of his power. He was a Grand Admiral, a modernizer, a kingmaker, and the brother of the Army's supreme commander. His family was inextricably woven into the very fabric of the war effort. His son, Karl Albrecht, was serving at the front, ending the war as a decorated colonel. The Habsburgs, and Karl Stephan's branch in particular, had staked everything on the empire's survival and victory. And now we must face the third cruel fact of his life, an irony so profound it's almost physically painful. It was all for nothing. His entire career, his decades of service, his rise to the rank of Grand Admiral, his modernization programs, his shipbuilding, his dreadnoughts, all of it was rendered utterly, completely, and comically meaningless in the autumn of 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Navy did not go out in a blaze of glory, in a climactic Trafalgar-like battle against the Italians. It simply ceased to exist. As the empire collapsed, it didn't just break apart on land, it broke apart at sea. The multi-ethnic crews did exactly what their counterparts on land were doing. They went home. The Croats and Slovenes claimed the ships in their ports for their new state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. The Italians, arriving as victors, seized what was left, including the flagship Viribus Unitas. The empire that Karl Stephan had served, the empire he had built a fleet for, had vanished, and its new borders left it as a small landlocked rump state. Karl Stephan, Grand Admiral of the Imperial and Royal Navy, was now a Grand Admiral with no navy. He was a sea lord with no sea. His entire career, his professional identity, his life's work had been built on a foundation that had just dissolved into thin air. It wasn't a defeat, it was an erasure. He was left sidelined, holding a meaningless, obsolete title from a phantom empire. This was the man who, at the age of 58, had to face a new reality. His wealth was in Poland, but its future was uncertain. His military career was a smoking ruin, and it was in this moment, this crucible of profound personal and professional loss, that the most defining and dramatic chapter of his life would begin. The dream of the Polish throne, once a distant ambition, was about to become his final desperate obsession. By 1916, the Great War had descended into a stalemate of mud and blood on the Western Front. But in the East, the tectonic plates of empires were in full-blown motion. The Russian Empire, diseased with corruption, incompetence, and the first stirrings of revolution, was cracking apart. The armies of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, had pushed deep into its territory, capturing Warsaw and vast swathes of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This military advance presented the Central Powers with both a massive opportunity and a critical problem. The problem was manpower. They were bleeding to death on a dozen fronts, and they desperately needed new soldiers. The opportunity was the land they now occupied, Poland. And in the hearts of the Poles, there was a burning desire for one thing, a nation. And so the great cynical game began. The Polish question, which had been a dormant issue in European diplomacy for a century, was suddenly the most important game on the board. On November 5, 1916, Germany and Austria-Hungary jointly issued a proclamation. It was a document that would change the course of Karl Stephan's life. It was the act of the 5th of November, and it promised the creation of a new independent kingdom of Poland. On the surface, it was a dream come true, a messianic moment for a nation that had been erased from the map. But in reality, it was a cold, calculated, and deeply cynical piece of wartime propaganda. The proclamation was masterfully vague. It promised a kingdom, but it didn't say who would be king. It promised an army, but it was clear this army's purpose was to be allied with and die for the Central Powers. It didn't mention borders, it didn't mention true sovereignty, and it didn't mention independence from Berlin and Vienna. Its goal was not to liberate Poland. Its goal was to get 1 million Polish recruits to enlist and go fight Russia. It was a puppet state in search of a puppet king. But for Archduke Karl Stephan, this was it. This was the starting gun. The phantom kingdom, cynical though its origins were, was now a political fact, a throne existed. And he, more than any man on earth, believed he was the one born to fill it. This was the moment Karl Stephan had been preparing for, consciously or not, for over 2 decades. As the politicians and generals in Berlin and Vienna began scrambling to find a suitable candidate, his name immediately rose to the top of every list, and the reasons were overwhelming. He wasn't some foppish German-speaking princeling from a distant duchy, being foisted on a foreign people. He was, in the eyes of many, already Polish. He was the Polish Habsburg. He had made his home at Żywiec Castle in the heart of Galicia. He spoke the language with perfect, unaccented fluency, a feat that stunned and charmed the Polish aristocracy. His wife, Maria Theresia, and their 6 children were also fluent, living and breathing Polish culture. He wasn't just a landowner, he was an industrialist, the master of the Żywiec brewery, a major employer and a respected pillar of the regional economy. He was a man of substance, and crucially, he was a man of culture. In 1916, in a move of profound symbolic power, he was appointed protector of the Polish Academy of Learning in Krakow. This wasn't a ceremonial role, it was a signal, a declaration. He was aligning himself not just with the Polish aristocracy, but with its intellectual and scientific elite. He was presenting himself as a modern, enlightened monarch, a man who would respect and champion Polish culture, not suppress it. His family was part of the package. His eldest son, Karl Albrecht, was also fluent, also deeply integrated, and serving in the military. He was the perfect Polish-speaking heir, guaranteeing a dynasty. And his other son, Wilhelm, was off managing the Ukrainian question, positioning himself as a leader for the Ukrainians, which, to the Germans and Austrians, made the family look like the perfect all-in-one solution for managing the entirety of Eastern Europe. He had built a resume so perfect, so tailored, for this exact moment that his candidacy seemed like a foregone conclusion. He was the safe choice, the logical choice, the only choice. But in the high-stakes, smoke-filled rooms of imperial politics, the logical choice is almost never the one that is made. Karl Stephan was about to learn that his most dangerous enemies were not the Russians or the French, but his own blood. And here we must confront the 4th cruel fact of his life, a fatal conflict of interest that came from the very top, from the man he had sworn a sacred oath to serve, his own relative, the new Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Emperor Charles I. In late 1916, the ancient Emperor Franz Joseph died, and his grandnephew Charles ascended to the throne. Charles was young, desperate, and inheriting a crumbling multi-ethnic empire that was being torn apart by the war. He was also a devout Catholic and, in his own way, a hopeless idealist who secretly and frantically trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. But he also had a different vision for Poland. He and his advisors had their own dream. It was a plan called trialism. They didn't want to just let Poland go as an independent kingdom, even one ruled by a Habsburg. They wanted to absorb it. Their plan was to transform the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary into a triple monarchy, Austria-Hungary-Poland. And the king of this new federated Polish kingdom would, of course, be himself, Emperor Charles. This made Karl Stephan, his own cousin, his most direct and dangerous internal rival. So while the German high command, including figures like General Ludendorff, began to lean heavily towards Karl Stephan as their preferred candidate, Emperor Charles began to sabotage him. It was a masterpiece of political duplicity. Publicly, he would tell the Germans that Karl Stephan was, of course, an excellent candidate, a loyal Habsburg. But privately, he stalled. He hesitated. He refused to give his official, final, decisive blessing. He would say Yes, but now is not the time. Yes, but we must consider the military situation. Yes, but what about the Hungarians? This delay was a slow-acting poison. It was fatal. It left Karl Stephan in a political purgatory. The Germans, who were meant to be his primary backers, grew deeply suspicious. Why wouldn't the Austrian emperor back his own cousin? What was the catch? They began to suspect that Karl Stephan was a Trojan horse for an Austrian plot to absorb Poland, which Germany would never allow. Karl Stephan, the man of action, the Grand Admiral, was forced to simply wait in Żywiec, a candidate in limbo, watching his life's ambition being quietly and methodically strangled by his own emperor. It was a betrayal born of dynastic jealousy and desperate, competing imperial dreams. And then the clock simply ran out. While he waited in Żywiec, while the politicians and royals dithered, the war was being lost. In the autumn of 1918, the German front in the west collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't just lose, it disintegrated. In a matter of weeks, it exploded into a dozen new independent nations. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed, ending the Great War. On that very same day in Warsaw, a new powerful figure emerged, Józef Piłsudski. He didn't declare a regency, he didn't call for a king, he declared the Second Polish Republic. The Kingdom of Poland, the phantom state born of the Act of 5th November, had existed for 2 years. It never had a king, it never had a government. It was a ghost. And with the rise of the Republic, the very concept of a Polish monarchy was dead. Karl Stephan's life's work, his 30-year project, his meticulous preparation, his mastery of the language, his industrial success, his family alliances, all of it had been rendered completely and utterly irrelevant. The game was over. He had lost. And he had lost without ever having been allowed to truly play. As if the loss of the Polish throne wasn't a deep enough tragedy, as if the betrayals by his own emperor and in-laws were not a bitter enough cup. The Habsburg family's grand ambitions were about to face a second parallel and perhaps even more devastating collapse. This is the story of the second nation that was lost, a story of romantic idealism, fatal political contradictions, and a final horrifying end in the dungeons of a Soviet prison. This is the story of Karl Stephan's youngest son, Archduke Wilhelm Franz of Austria. To understand the full scope of the family's failure, we must understand Wilhelm. He was not his father. Karl Stephan was a pragmatist, a Grand Admiral, a politician, and an industrialist. He was a man of the 19th century, playing a calculated game of chess. Wilhelm was a man of the 20th century. He was a romantic, a poet, a figure whose complex personal life would later lead to him being seen as a bisexual icon, a rebellious spirit, and a passionate idealist. And while his father had strategically embedded himself in Poland, Wilhelm, perhaps as an act of youthful rebellion, or perhaps with his father's tacit approval, turned his gaze to the other great stateless nation of Eastern Europe, Ukraine. Ukraine, like Poland, was a nation in chains, a people with a deep history, a unique language, and a powerful nationalist dream, but who were divided between two competing empires. The Habsburgs in Vienna, in their endless, complex game against Russia, had long cultivated Ukrainian nationalism as a counterweight to both the Russians and their own Polish subjects in Galicia. It was a classic divide-and-rule strategy. Into this world stepped the young, impressionable Archduke Wilhelm. He was stationed in Galicia, and he became utterly, profoundly enchanted. He didn't just learn the Ukrainian language, he mastered it, reportedly speaking it with a perfect accent. He didn't just observe the culture, he adopted it. He read Ukrainian poetry, he formed deep friendships with Ukrainian intellectuals and soldiers, and most famously, he began to wear the traditional Ukrainian embroidered shirt, the vyshyvanka. This was not a costume. It was a declaration. He became known lovingly among the Ukrainian people as Vasil Vyshyvanyi, Basil the Embroidered. He was their prince, their red prince. He was, in their eyes, a Habsburg who saw them, who respected them, who believed in their cause. When World War I broke out, this cultural fascination became a powerful military and political tool. Wilhelm became the patron, protector, and, in many ways, the spiritual leader of the Ukrainian Sikh riflemen. This was a legion of Ukrainian patriots fighting for Austria-Hungary, but with the explicit, burning hope that their service would be rewarded with an independent, unified Ukraine. Wilhelm was their man in Vienna, their royal advocate. He fought for them, he secured them better treatment, and he shielded them from the suspicions of Polish and Austrian commanders who distrusted them. In return, they adored him. They saw him as the living embodiment of their future, their potential king. And so the Habsburg family was now, in 1917, playing two simultaneous games. Karl Stephan was the Polish king in waiting based in Żywiec. His son, Vasil Vyshyvanyi, was the Ukrainian king in waiting, leading his loyal riflemen. It was a breathtakingly ambitious, breathtakingly dangerous plan. They were trying to secure two thrones for one family, but they had overlooked one fatal, inescapable reality. Here we must confront the sixth cruel fact of Karl Stephan's life. This was the internal familial contradiction that would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of his Polish ambitions. Wilhelm's Ukrainian dream and Karl Stephan's Polish dream were mutually exclusive. They were at war with each other. To Polish nationalists, Ukrainian nationalism was not a parallel struggle for freedom. It was an existential threat. The two nascent states had immediate, overlapping, and non-negotiable territorial claims. The most explosive of these was the city of Lviv, or Lwów. To the Poles, it was a sacred, ancient Polish city. To the Ukrainians, it was the capital of their Western Ukrainian People's Republic. In 1918, they would fight a bloody, brutal war over it. Now imagine you are a Polish aristocrat in 1917. You are considering backing Archduke Karl Stephan for the throne. He seems perfect. He speaks Polish. He lives at Żywiec. His daughters married into your best families. But then you look at his son. His son, Wilhelm, is the patron saint of the Ukrainian Sikh riflemen, the very soldiers who are, at that very moment, preparing to fight and kill Poles to steal the city of Lwów. Karl Stephan's enemies, and he had many, now had the perfect, unimpeachable weapon to destroy him. His treacherous in-laws, the Radziwiłłs and Czartoryskis, could now go to the German and Austrian leadership and say, "How can you support this man? He can't even control his own family. He is playing a double game." Polish patriots could justifiably ask, "How can we trust a king whose son is the champion of our mortal enemies?" It made Karl Stephan look, at best, like a naive fool, and at worst, like a duplicitous traitor to the Polish cause. The family's grand two-pronged strategy had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. By trying to secure two crowns, they had created a fatal conflict of interest that made them toxic to both sides. The very complexity of their ambition became the instrument of its failure. The family was trying to be all things to all people in a land that was being torn apart by either-or nationalism. It was impossible. The two-kingdom dream collapsed, taking Karl Stephan's Polish dream down with it. But the tragedy of Archduke Wilhelm and the seventh cruel fact for the Habsburg family was only just beginning. His story does not end with the loss of a crown in 1918. It ends in a darkness so profound it serves as a horrifying symbol for the family's total and complete erasure from Eastern Europe. When the empires collapsed in 1918, both Karl Stephan and Wilhelm were left stateless. Karl Stephan, as we know, settled into a quiet, resigned life as a private citizen in the new Polish Republic. Wilhelm did not. He became a man without a country, a ghost of a king. He lived in exile, moving between Paris, Munich, and Vienna. He was a flamboyant, well-known figure, but he was politically adrift, a man still desperately, and now pathetically, trying to lobby for the Ukrainian cause to a world that had moved on. Then came the 1930s and the rise of Hitler. Wilhelm, now living in Vienna, was in a dangerous position. When the Nazis annexed Austria, they put him under surveillance. He was, after all, a Habsburg, a family the Nazis despised. But more than that, he was an anti-Nazi, and he was staunchly, and just as importantly, anti-Soviet. He saw both totalitarian regimes as the twin executioners of his beloved Ukraine. During World War II, this forgotten prince, this stateless Archduke, made his last brave stand. He reportedly began to use his old aristocratic connections to assist Allied contacts, passing information about Nazi movements to British and French intelligence. It was a quiet, desperate act of defiance. The war ends. Vienna is liberated, but it is a city occupied by the victors. And in the Soviet sector, the new masters of Eastern Europe have a very, very long memory. They know exactly who Vasil Vyshevanyi is. To them, he is not a romantic poet. He is a Habsburg. He is a bourgeois nationalist, the ultimate symbol of Ukrainian independence. He is an English spy. He is, in short, an enemy of the people, a dangerous loose end that must be tied up. In 1947, the trap was sprung. Soviet agents operating on the streets of Vienna kidnapped him. He was spirited away, smuggled across the border, and transported to the one city on earth that represented the dark, twisted mirror of his life's dream, Kiev, the capital of what was now Soviet Ukraine. He was taken to the infamous Lukyanivka prison, the central political prison of the NKVD, the forerunner to the KGB. What happened next was the final brutal act of the Habsburg tragedy in the East. For months, the 52-year-old Archduke was subjected to relentless, brutal interrogation. He was a Habsburg prince, an agent of British intelligence, a Ukrainian nationalist. He was guilty of everything the Soviet regime feared and hated. He was, in their eyes, the living embodiment of the old world they had come to destroy. He was sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag, but he would never make it. His body, weakened by years of hardship, was broken by the interrogations. He had tuberculosis, and it was left untreated. In the suffocating, hopeless confines of the prison hospital, alone, forgotten by the world, Archduke Wilhelm Vasil Vyshevanyi, the poet prince, the would-be king of Ukraine, died. The date was August 18th, 1948. He was buried, like thousands of other victims of the terror, in an unmarked, anonymous grave on the prison grounds. There was no funeral. There was no obituary. A Habsburg Archduke, a direct descendant of emperors, a man who had commanded armies and charmed nations, was simply erased. This was the final devastating loss. Karl Stephan had lost his ambition for a crown and died a private, if disappointed, citizen. His son Wilhelm, who had perhaps loved the dream more passionately, was physically consumed and destroyed by the new totalitarian monster that had risen in the lands they once hoped to rule. The family hadn't just lost two nations. One nation had politely but firmly rejected their royal ambitions. The other nation had hunted down their heir, tortured him, and buried him in an unmarked pit. The Habsburg dream in Eastern Europe was not just over. It had been given a final, brutal, and anonymous burial. The death of Archduke Wilhelm in a Kiev prison in 1948 is, in many ways, the final, brutal postscript to the Habsburg family's ambitions in Eastern Europe. It is a story of such perfect, horrifying tragedy that it almost eclipses the main drama. But we must now return to the man at the center of this web, the man whose ambition set all of this heartbreak in motion, and who had to live through the initial devastating collapse of his entire world. The Polish magnates, the Radziwiłłs, and the Czartoryskis, the families he had bound his own to through the marriage of his daughters, turned their backs on him. They played their own ancient, ruthless game of politics, hedging their bets and ultimately prioritizing their Russian-held estates over their new naive Habsburg father-in-law. But the most devastating blows were perhaps not personal, but systemic. The entire world that had given him his name, his rank, and his purpose simply ceased to exist. And this brings us to the eighth cruel fact of his life, the profound, soul-crushing loss of empire and identity. The year 1918 was not just a military defeat. It was an apocalypse for the old order. In a matter of weeks, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that 600-year-old dynasty, that sprawling multi-ethnic colossus, did not just surrender. It evaporated. It exploded into a dozen new, fractious, and competing nation-states. For Karl Stephan, this was not an abstract political event. It was the end of his world. First, his career, his title of Grand Admiral, the rank he had earned over a lifetime of service, the rank of a kingmaker, was now a meaningless comical relic. He was a Grand Admiral with no empire, no emperor, and most literally, no navy. The fleet he had helped design, the modern dreadnoughts he had championed, were now scrap metal or prizes of war for the Italians and the new Yugoslav state. His entire professional life, his expertise, his status, all of it was rendered obsolete overnight. Second, his titles. He was no longer His Imperial and Royal Highness Archduke Karl Stephan of Austria, Prince of Tuscany, etc. The new small Republic of Austria, in a fit of revolutionary fervor, abolished its aristocracy. The Habsburg Law of 1919 formally banished all members of the dynasty who would not renounce their claims and live as simple private citizens. All titles, all privileges, all imperial status were declared null and void. He was, in the eyes of his homeland, a non-person. He was, in short, temporarily made stateless by the dissolution of Austria. And so in a final, poignant, and deeply ironic gesture, Karl Stephan did something remarkable. He chose to stay in Żywiec. He, his wife, and his children applied for and were granted citizenship in the new Second Polish Republic. Let the full bitter irony of this sink in. The man who had prepared for 30 years to rule Poland, the man who had been rejected as its king, now humbly asked to be its citizen. The man who had been a prince of one of the world's greatest empires was now a mere citizen of a new, unstable, and chaotic republic. He was allowed to keep his property at Żywiec, but he was a man without a role. He lived out his days as Pan Karl Stephan Habsburg, living in his own castle but as a political ghost. And the final twist? The republic he had just joined was, by its very nature, a rejection of everything he was. Poland, reborn, had chosen to be a republic, not a monarchy. Its new leader was Józef Piłsudski, a socialist, a soldier, and a revolutionary who had spent his life fighting the very empires that Karl Stephan represented. He was a living contradiction, a would-be king living in a land that had no use for kings, a Habsburg patriot living in a Polish nationalist state, a Grand Admiral who was now landlocked. He was a living relic, a walking, talking embodiment of a world that was gone forever. It was a humiliation not of violence, but of relevance. He had become a footnote in his own lifetime. But the cruelties of history were not yet finished with the Habsburgs of Żywiec. Karl Stephan himself would die in 1933, just as a new, darker storm was gathering over Europe. He was perhaps lucky. He was spared from seeing the final, complete, and economic ruin of his family. If Karl Stephan was the Polish Habsburg, his son Karl Albrecht was simply Polish. He was the fulfillment of his father's project. He too spoke fluent Polish. He had served in the Polish military. When Germany invaded in 1939, Karl Albrecht, as a Polish general, did his duty. He fought the Nazis. He was captured, held as a prisoner of war, and because he was a Habsburg who refused to declare loyalty to Germany, he was relentlessly persecuted by the Gestapo. His wife, a Swedish aristocrat, was active in the Polish underground resistance. They were, by any definition, Polish heroes. But when the war ended, the Nazis were not replaced by the freedom they had fought for. They were replaced by a new, equally brutal occupying power, the Soviet Union, and the new Polish communist regime they installed. To the communists, Karl Albrecht was a triple-damned enemy. He was an aristocrat, he was a Habsburg, and he was a high-ranking Polish officer loyal to the non-communist, pre-war republic. He was everything they had come to destroy. In 1948, the same year his brother Wilhelm was dying in a Kiev prison, Karl Albrecht was arrested by the Polish Communist Secret Police. This loyal Polish general, this anti-Nazi war hero, was thrown into a squalid prison. According to his family's accounts, he was tortured so brutally that by the time he was released from prison in 1951, he was a broken man, left half-blind and partially paralyzed. And as this was happening, the regime delivered the final blow. The laws of nationalization, which had been passed in 1946, were now ruthlessly enforced. The communists seized everything: the vast family estates, Żywiec Castle, their home, and most symbolically, the Żywiec Brewery. The brewery, that magnificent industrial engine, that symbol of Karl Stephan's integration and his family's wealth, the source of their power, was stolen by the state. It was a complete and total economic execution. When Karl Albrecht was finally released from prison in 1951, a broken and crippled man, he was a pauper. He was a Polish hero who had been destroyed by the very nation he had served. His family's entire life's work confiscated. He and his family were forced to flee Poland, the country they had given everything for, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. This was the final devastating balance sheet of Karl Stephan's Polish project. The man who had brought his family to Poland with dreams of a crown had 2 generations later resulted in one son being tortured and buried in a Soviet prison, and the other son being tortured, crippled, and stripped of his every possession by the Polish state. The Habsburgs of Żywiec, once among the wealthiest families in Europe, were now impoverished, stateless exiles. It was a ruin so complete, so absolute, it was hard to believe it wasn't the plot of some dark, vindictive novel. Karl Stephan died in his bed at Żywiec Castle on April 14th, 1933. He died a private citizen of Poland, a man without a title, without an empire, and without a crown. He had lived just long enough to see the world that had rejected him begin to devour itself. He died just months after Adolf Hitler took power in Germany, and as his own adopted country of Poland was slipping deeper into the authoritarian rule of his old rival, Józef Piłsudski, the stable, enlightened constitutional monarchy he had once envisioned for Poland, with himself at its head, was a laughable pipe dream in this new brutal world of fascist and communist dictators. His old world ideals, the 19th century belief in noble patronage and dynastic destiny, were utterly useless against the jackboots, the secret police, and the concentration camps of the New Order. This is his ultimate legacy. He is not remembered as a great king. He is not even remembered as a great failure, like his relative Emperor Maximilian of Mexico. He is, for the most part, simply not remembered. His story is completely overshadowed. When we think of the end of the Habsburgs, we think of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the tragedy of the young Emperor Charles, or the sad story of Empress Zita. When we think of the birth of Poland, we think of Piłsudski or Paderewski or Roman Dmowski. Karl Stephan exists in the margins, a footnote in the biographies of other more important men. His life, so full of ambition, so meticulously planned, so dedicated to a single powerful goal, ultimately amounted to nothing. He represents the tragic, quiet, and complete end of Habsburg dreams in Eastern Europe. He is a case study in how the grand, impersonal, and brutal machinery of 20th century history, of total war, of competing nationalisms, of totalitarian ideologies, can crush even the most powerful, privileged, and prepared individual. He was the man who did everything right at the exact wrong moment in history. He was the king who never was. All the grand, crashing, dissonant music of his life, the naval brass, the artillery of the Great War, the frantic, shouted debates of high politics, the whispers of betrayal, all of it finally, abruptly went silent in November 1918. What is the sound of a dream dying? It is not a bang. It is a profound, deafening silence. This is the sound that greeted Archduke Karl Stephan for the last 15 years of his life. This was his epilogue, an existence defined not by what he was, but by what he almost was. He had lost his empire. He had lost his rank. He had lost his candidacy. He had lost, in a very real sense, his entire purpose for being. Now began the strangest and perhaps the most psychologically grueling part of his journey. It was no longer a battle against empires and traitors. It was a quiet internal battle against irrelevance. He was a man who had commanded the seas, and now his world was a castle in the Polish mountains. He was a man who had shaken hands with emperors and generals who decided the fate of nations, and now he was simply Pan Habsburg, a citizen. His first and final act of political significance was a signature on a piece of paper. He, his wife Maria Theresia, and his children, including his heir Karl Albrecht, formally applied for and were granted citizenship in the new, chaotic, and proudly Republican Second Polish Republic. Let us not underestimate the profound weight of this decision. This was not a simple administrative gesture. This was a complete and total renunciation of his past. He, a prince of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, a dynasty that had ruled Austria for 600 years, was formally severing himself from it. He was turning his back on the new rump state of Austria that had, in truth, already turned its back on him by abolishing its nobility. He was, in this final act, making his ultimate gamble. He was declaring, "I am not Austrian. My home is not Vienna. My loyalty is not to a dead empire. My loyalty is here. I am Polish." It was the final logical conclusion of the Polish project he had begun decades earlier, but it was a project that had begun with the grand soaring ambition of a crown, and it was now ending with the quiet, humble reality of a passport. And so, he became the ghost in the castle. The new Polish government, led by his ideological antithesis, the socialist revolutionary Józef Piłsudski, was content to leave him be. He was not a threat. He was a curiosity. He was the tamed Habsburg, the Archduke who had become a citizen. He was allowed to keep his estates, his castle, and his brewery for now. He was, after all, a major employer, and the new state was bankrupt and desperate. Imagine the psychological whiplash. Imagine waking up every single day in the same grand bed, in the same magnificent castle, surrounded by the same servants. You walk the same halls lined with the portraits of your imperial ancestors. You look out the same window over the same vast forests and the same bustling brewery that you have managed for decades. Everything is exactly the same, and yet everything has changed. The power is gone. The letters that arrive are no longer from the imperial chancellery in Vienna or the German high command in Berlin. They are from tax collectors, local suppliers, and county officials. He was no longer a Grand Admiral, a maker of policy. He was a businessman, a landowner, a private citizen who had to obey the laws of a republic he had never asked for. He would have spent his days managing the brewery. The Żywiec's brewery, now a Polish company, not an Austrian one, was his primary focus. He and his son Karl Albrecht poured their energy into it. It was perhaps his only solace. In the world of business, at least, his decisions still mattered. He was still a captain of industry, and the brewery thrived under his and his son's leadership. But what did he think about in the long, quiet evenings, when he sat in his library, the throne of Poland, now an impossible, childish fantasy? He was thinking about his family. And in his family he could see the entire tragedy of his life played out in miniature. He would have looked at his eldest son, Karl Albrecht. Here was the heir to the crown that never was. And what was Karl Stephan to do with him? The ambition, the training, the immense dynastic pressure had to be channeled somewhere. It was here that Karl Stephan made his final poignant transition. If his family could not rule Poland, they would serve Poland. Karl Albrecht, embracing his father's new path, joined the Polish army. It was a powerful statement. He was not a disgruntled, exiled prince plotting a restoration. He was a loyal citizen soldier, swearing an oath to the Republic. He fought for Poland in its brief, brutal border war against Czechoslovakia in 1919. He was in every sense the fulfillment of his father's project. He was Polish. Karl Stephan would have been immensely proud, but it must have been a pride tinged with a deep private sorrow. This was the son he had groomed to be a king, and now he was a major in an army, taking orders from men who were once his father's social inferiors. Then he would think of his youngest son, Wilhelm, the lost son, the romantic, the poet, the would-be king of Ukraine. Wilhelm, unlike his father, refused to go quiet. He did not settle down. He did not become a citizen of a new republic. He became an exile. He drifted through Europe, a glittering, tragic figure in the salons of Paris, a man without a country, still desperately, fruitlessly, lobbying for the Ukrainian cause to a world that had long since moved on. He was a constant, painful reminder of the family's overreach, of the fatal contradiction that had helped destroy the Polish dream. We can only imagine the letters between Żywiec and Paris. The father pleading for stability, the son for, what? Money? Support for a lost cause? He was a living embodiment of the family's failure, a wound that would not and could not heal. And then, most excruciatingly, he would sit down for dinner. He would sit down with his wife and with his daughters, Eleonora Radziwiłł and Renata Czartoryski. This is a scene from a play that Tennessee Williams or Henrik Ibsen would have killed. To write. Imagine the crushing, suffocating politeness, the polite inquiries about health, the polite discussions about grandchildren, and underneath it all, the seething, unspoken, monumental reality. Your husbands betrayed me. The men his daughters had married, the princes of Poland's greatest houses, were the very men who had actively and successfully lobbied against him. They had chosen their Russian estates and their own cynical political games over their own family. Did his daughters know? Of course they did. Did they defend their husbands? Did they beg their father for forgiveness? Or did they all just participate in the grand aristocratic charade of pretending that nothing had happened, that it was all just politics? Every visit, every family gathering, every holiday at Żywiec Castle would have been a fresh private humiliation. He was forced to break bread with his own betrayers, to smile at the men who had put the final fatal daggers into his royal ambitions. It was a quiet, domestic, and perfectly polished torture that he had to endure for the rest of his life. He, Karl Stephan, a man of the old 19th century order, had to sit and watch the 20th century truly begin. And it was a horror show. In 1926, he witnessed his new homeland, the Polish Republic, which had so proudly rejected the tyranny of a monarchy, descend into tyranny. Józef Piłsudski, the revolutionary hero, grew tired of the bickering, chaotic democracy and launched the May coup. He rolled tanks into Warsaw, overthrew the elected government, and established a de facto military dictatorship, the Sanation regime, that would last until the Nazi invasion. Imagine the bitter, terrible vindication Karl Stephan must have felt. You rejected me, he might have thought, a Habsburg, a man bred for constitutional rule, a man who would have brought stability, order, and a connection to all of Europe. And you replace me with this, a soldier on a horse, a dictator. He had been poised for a throne, and he had to watch a new, more brutal kind of king simply take power by force. But it was what was happening beyond his borders that must have truly chilled his blood. To the west in Germany, he watched the entire agonizing spectacle of the Weimar Republic. He saw the hyperinflation, the street violence between Nazis and communists, the breakdown of society. And in January 1933, just 3 months before his own death, he would have read the news. Adolf Hitler, a low-born Austrian, a former corporal, had been appointed Chancellor of Germany. To the east, he saw the rise of the Soviet Union, a new godless totalitarian empire built on the bones of the Russia he had known. The Bolsheviks, who had murdered the Tsar's entire family, were now consolidating a power more absolute and more terrifying than any emperor had ever dreamed of. This was his final, bitter cup. He was a man of the old world, a world of tradition, hierarchy, and limits, and he lived just long enough to see a new world born, a world of new, ideological kings who had no limits whatsoever, a world of dictators, of secret police, of racial purity laws, of state-sponsored terror. His dream of a stable, enlightened Polish Habsburg monarchy, which had seemed so vital and ambitious in 1916, now looked quaint. It looked like a gentle, harmless fantasy from a forgotten age. The world had not chosen his path. It had chosen the path of Piłsudski, of Stalin, and of Hitler. In the end, Karl Stephan, the man who had lost a kingdom, was forced to bear witness to the end of the world that had created kingdoms. On April 14, 1933, as the new Dark Age was dawning, Archduke Karl Stephan died at Żywiec Castle. He was 72 years old. He died a Polish citizen. He died a private, wealthy, and profoundly disappointed man. His beloved wife, Maria Theresia, the woman who had followed him, learned his languages, and shared in his ambitions and his defeats, died just a few months later in December. It was as if she could not or would not remain in this new, terrifying world without him. They were buried, the family scattered, and the great storm that Karl Stephan had seen gathering on the horizon a storm that would lead to the invasion of his adopted Poland, the horrors of World War II, the torture of his son Karl Albrecht, and the fate of his son Wilhelm, was finally ready to break. So what, in the end, is the story of Archduke Karl Stephan? What is the final lesson from this life of such immense, unfulfilled, and tragic ambition? It is perhaps the ultimate cruel irony. Here was a man born into the 1% of the 1%, a prince of the blood, a Grand Admiral, an industrial magnate, a man of staggering wealth and privilege, a life that, from the outside, seemed to be a guarantee of success, power, and glory. And yet his story is one of a life defined by relentless, catastrophic loss. It is a story of repeated betrayals, betrayal by his emperor, by his allies, and, most intimately, by the very families he had grafted his own onto. It's a story of lost opportunities, a crown so close he could almost taste it, only to have it dissolve into a phantom. And it is a story of unimaginable familial sacrifice, played out across the blood-soaked soil of two nations. He reached for a crown in Poland, only to be rejected. He watched his son reach for a crown in Ukraine, only to see that ambition lead to a Soviet prison and an unmarked grave. His life is a perfect, brutal microcosm of an entire world's end. Karl Stephan, with his 19th century ideals of noble patronage, dynastic alliances, and enlightened monarchy, was a man perfectly designed for a world that was, at that very moment, being burned to the ground. He was a master chess player who arrived at the tournament, only to find the new game was not chess. It was a brutal, no-rules, back-alley brawl with knives, and he had shown up in a dinner jacket. His story, and the story of his sons, exemplifies how the total chaos of the First World War and its toxic aftermath did not just redraw borders. It shattered destinies. It vaporized ancient monarchies. And it left the men who had been bred to lead them, the would-be kings, the archdukes, the princes, as little more than confused, tragic, and forgotten footnotes in the new, ruthless textbooks of history. Karl Stephan's life, in the end, is a deeply human, deeply painful, and emotionally realistic lesson. It's a reminder that privilege is no shield against the brutal machinery of history. It's a story about the fragility of human experience, the terrible cost of ambition, and the profound personal suffering that is so often hidden beneath the grand, impersonal narratives of war, politics, and the collapse of empires. He was the man who wanted to be a king, but who found himself instead a citizen. He was a man who had everything, and who in the end lost it all. Not just the empires, the titles, or the wealth, but the very future he had so meticulously and so disastrously tried to build. His is the quiet, haunting tragedy of the king who never was.